And we're back. You're listening to the Talking Boxing with Billy C show. Glad you could join us. And don't forget, when we're talking about joining, follow us on Twitter. That's right. It's at Talkin Boxing. That's TalkinBoxing. And, oh, yeah. Don't forget to buy my book. That's right. You got to get a bunch of copies, man. Not just one. You got to get 10 or 12. Tom Molyneux, From Bondage to Baddest Man on the Planet. It's available where all good books are sold, including Barnes & Noble and Amazon.com. Now, if you're looking to get a signed copy, visit my website, www.billycboxing.com, and click on the book club section, which is on the menu on the left, and it'll tell you. Plus, buy some other books that are in the book club. And you can even buy a movie starring our very own Alex Pierpaoli. And speaking of Alex...
Blast from the past. We shine the spotlight again on fighters from years past.
Top-ranking Joe Louis is the leading contender.
Joe Frazier with a left hook. Good right hand thrown by Foreman that time.
Look at that left hook. Belt that goes to Ray Mancini. It's Blast from the Past on Talkin' Boxing.
And this week's Blast from the Past features, like I said earlier, former world champion. He's a boxing Hall of Famer, and he's also regarded in most people's pound-for-pound all-time top 10 list is the late, great Joe Gans. And joining us right now to tell us all about Joe Gans is Alex Pierpaoli. What's up, brother?
Good evening, Billy C. How are you?
Just trying to stay cool. It's better today than it was yesterday and the day before, but I don't want to say I'm ready for winter because I'll be the little girl freeze. I'm cold. I'm so cold, But I gotta have someplace in between, I mean, this is brutal the other way,
True, but fall is coming, and but you're right. I'm sure it's going to be a brutal winter too. So it'll be just a few more months before we'll be saying, "Oh my God, when will it end?" Yeah, right. We'll be going. Can't wait for summer, man. This cold, this BS, But exactly.
But anyway, Joe Gans. I know we've done him once before, and there's so much. This guy is such a fascinating story. Tell us about Joe Gans.
Well, I couldn't find where we did, but I really feel like we did it too, but I couldn't find it. So I don't know if we ever did.
Maybe that was BA before Alex.
Maybe BA, yeah. It was BA. I'm sorry, Joseph, just taking a sip of water. Joseph Gans. His actual name is actually Joseph Gant, but that he was born Joseph Cephas Butts, and he was named after his father. But I guess his father, this was from Colleen Acock's, her and Mark Scott did a lot of research on him. They wrote a book on Joe Gans, and I saw that he's listed as his birth name was Joseph Gant. That actually seems to be the name that was taken by a foster parent. His foster mother, Maria Jackson Gant. And then once he started fighting, it started to be misprinted in papers as Gans, and it eventually stuck. And even his children took that name. But it actually, his birth name was Butts, B-U-T-T-S. So that's a good trivia question right there. He was born August 10th, November 25th, 1874 in Baltimore, Maryland, and he was 5'6.5" and fought as a lightweight. We're talking about this is just after the gloved era. He was the third lightweight champion in history. So, like you said, that is pretty impressive. That even today, he still is recognized by a lot of people as one of the sort of pioneers of the sport. And he really is. This was sort of, there was a huge gulf in the sport. Sort of had a revolution in the character, in the styles of fighting of a guy like Joe Gans. Because previous to him and other fights fighters, to some degree, it were fighters of color, black fighters at this age, especially in America. There was having mixed race bouts was extremely taboo. We're still talking about Jim Crow America. The Civil War ended in 1864. So we're only talking, it's not even a little over a generation, 2 generations since the Civil War. And there was even times where one of the fights, the fight with Frank Erne, ended up going across into Canada rather than being held in Buffalo, because that idea of having a white man versus a black man was just something that Americans in a lot of areas could not countenance. They didn't want to, risk seeing a white man lose against a black man, and what that would, both the sociological implications and the implications just on the crowd. But Joe Gans, so his style was very different from a lot of these cruder guys who were definitely, just one step removed from the sort of John L. Sullivan type brawlers.
Joe Gans was loved by the boxing fans, and he was a real respectful guy, sort of the anti Jack Johnson, who was hanging around the same era, and these were two different guys, being men of color, and how they were regarded by Jim Crow America. Joe Gans, I think, was a little more accepted than Jack Johnson, but by all means, neither one of them had an easy time of it. We knew that. But Joe Gans fought a lot of. Obviously, we'll talk about the Battle of Nelson fights in a sec. But he fought a lot of big names, like is the case with all of our blasts from the past generally. But some names that stick out to me: Dave Holly was a quality fighter. Joe Grimm, a quality fighter. But check out some of the other names like Mike Twin Sullivan, Kid Griffo, Sam Langford. People always think of Sam Langford as a heavyweight, but he started out in this division with Joe Gans. Also Jack Blackburn, who would go on to become a pretty well-known trainer. So I mean, there's a lot of parallels with the late great Joe Gans.
Yes, definitely, and that's one of the things that I guess must be Nat Fletcher who coined the phrase "the 3 aces," and I guess at the time, or maybe he did say there were 2 aces, that it was George Dixon and Joe Walcott, and I would assume that he must have meant well,
he fought those guys too.
Yeah, because George Dixon. Yeah, I guess those were the 2 because. It was definitely, there was a black connotation to it, like the Ace of Spades, of course, is black. But see, the thing that I don't understand is that, because I was listening to, there's an interview with Colleen online, and I was a little confused about that, because she talks about the aces, and I'm not sure if there were only 2 that Fleischer referred to, and that she felt that there actually should be 4, that you should include Dixon, Walcott, Gans, and Jack Johnson. And like you said, this whole era, and all 4 of them were a revolution in the sport, and they knew each other. One thing that you're absolutely right about that is interesting is how Joe Gans was a little more accepted, even though he, had this big strike against him in the mind of the public, in that it was the color of his skin. He didn't seem to rub America the wrong way that in the similar way that Jack Johnson did, and he even had a white mistress, but it was not, and that was a mistress too. It wasn't even a wife. Johnson's white women in his life, he was usually married to. That was what caused all the controversy. It was it was even his legal wife that.
And then he got arrested for it. His wife, we're talking about Jack Johnson now. His wife is what he got charged with the Mann Act. The only person ever in the history of the United States that ever got charged with and convicted of the Mann Act. So they were out to get him, but that's a whole nother story. But
right, and I think that does say something about how people looked at Joe Gans. For some reason, Gans, and I think it probably was his personality. I mean, Jack Johnson was the kind of guy who he liked to brag, and I think also the weight was another factor. Because remember, this is one thing too that I think is interesting that you got to think about in the time. The average size of a male person at that time was like 5'2" to 5'4", about 125 pounds. So Joe Gans is, a pretty sizable, muscular representative of America. Now, a Jack Johnson, of course, the heavyweight champion, is like something akin to a Paul Bunyan. This is a folk hero. So the fact that Jack Johnson was a heavyweight, I think that was another factor of why he couldn't, plus of his attitude and his like style of braggadocio. I think that was what people couldn't deal with. But Joe Gans was not like that. I mean, he was a quiet guy, respectful guy. He had learned the value of work from his mother. His mother was and I assume we're talking his foster mother, of course. She was a washerwoman, which was an incredibly difficult job where you got, and typically it'd be wealthier people, white people, who you would do their laundry all day, and we're talking against a washboard. That's hard work. So he learned those kind of values. He worked as an oyster shucker, another hard, labor-intensive job.
Yeah, and what was it? It wasn't it the Ali and George Chuvalo? Well, didn't he dress as a washerwoman?
Yes, he called Chuvalo the washerwoman.
Yeah, and he came dressed. Chuvalo came to a press conference dressed like a woman. Anyway, let's talk about. I mean, listen, Joe Gans. We could go on for hours and hours with this guy, and anybody that wants to learn everything about Joe Gans. Alex has mentioned the book on Joe Gans, written by Colleen Aycock and Mark Scott. Terrific read. I highly recommend it. But the fights that I mean, Jimmy Britt fight. We mentioned all the other names I just threw out there that he fought. I mean, all great fights. But I think the fight that means the most, at least to me, was his fights with Battle and Nelson, specifically the first fight that took place in Goldfield, Nevada. I actually went to Goldfield, Nevada one time because it was still considered a ghost town, and I was a little disappointed at what it looked like. I was expecting tumbleweeds and like an old Wild West front, and instead I saw rusted out cars and mobile homes upside down and stuff like that. But the bottom line is Battle in Nelson, Goldfield, Nevada, against Joe Gans on September 3rd, 1906. An amazing fight, Alex. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that was that was when people, got all flipping out about Pacquiao Mayweather. Mayweather Pacquiao, I should say. They were throwing around the phrase "fight of the century." That certainly was a fight of the century where the whole town was almost built around it in a way. The population of the town swelled the week of the fight. We don't have things like that anymore, at least not in boxing. And I think that's one of the things that there was. I would assume that it was September 3rd. It's not quite. Or maybe it has. Does Labor Day ever come that early? Because it very often back then, because it was such a working, people worked, and this was a working man's sport to some degree. So they even though there was anybody from kings and queens to cutthroats at ringside. they still tend to have the big fights around holidays because they knew like it would be the day of Labor Day or on July 4th or something like this. So September 3rd, I wonder if that was Labor Day Monday.
It was, and if I recall correctly from Colleen and Mark's book, there were other fights, not just that night. There was a couple of nights worth of fights. It was like a multi-day event for this fight. And remember, this is when they put the gold. Remember, they put the gold. They had the stacks of the prize money, the purse money, stacks of gold in the window, so people could see it. That was attracting all kinds of fanfare. And they constructed the stadium too. Didn't they build the stadium right there? And wasn't that the same fight that the wood didn't even get a chance to get all of the sap out of it? People were like stuck to their seats, literally. Remember?
Right.
I'm stuck to my seat. No, really, I'm stuck. I can't get up. But the thing that gets me the most about this fight, and for people that don't know this, the fight ended after 42 rounds. Now, we're not talking about Tom Molyneux era where a 42-round fight could have lasted 10 minutes because they called a round when a fighter hit the ground. These were 3-minute rounds, okay? This was 100 degrees that day. It was really hot. It was extremely hot. People were passing out and everything else. And these guys were fighting. I think Mark Scott ended up getting the whole fight, just about the whole fight on tape. He pieced it all together. It's amazing. The thing that always stuck out in my mind, Alex, 42 rounds. It was 3 hours worth of fighting, okay? 3 hours. This fight lasted 3 hours, okay? How, and you see the footage that they had the towels trying to keep the fighters cool. And there was another thing. If I recall correctly, they made Joe Gans weigh in all fully dressed at ringside, right? Remember, like I think it was like an hour before or 2 hours before he had to go weigh in all dressed, gloved up with his trunks and everything to make sure. And it was like a crazy weight that he had to come in at.
He had to make 133, which was it was just this strange stipulation where he had to be weakened. It really, I don't get it, and it didn't really seem to.
And he got no, it wasn't fair. And he got less of the purse. Remember, Battle and Nelson got all the money, right? He was the white guy, of course. And anyway, the thing that always got me, and people, you forget about this, but they had water ringside, okay, but 3 hours in the desert. Goldfield, Nevada is in the middle of the desert, okay? There's no ice buckets back then, and they had no plastic bottles. The water that these guys were being refreshed with in between rounds is sitting in glass bottles. How refreshing could a splash of water that's sitting in 100-degree heat be after 2 hours of fighting and going into 3? It's just mind-boggling what these two guys endured.
Yeah, it really, there's nothing to compare it to, and that's why, I think, because I saw a little bit of the little video you were talking about earlier, where Mayweather is ranking the greatest fighters of all time. I think that, when you have to learn about things like this to learn some perspective when people say those words, greatest of all time, because, you've got to be specific. The thing about our sport is that, to the outsider, it looks very simple, but there is a lot of complexity and a lot of nuance in it. And when you throw around the phrase "greatest of all time," you need to really know what you're better than. And the idea that, in his career, some of the challenges he's faced compared to some of the things that have just gone down in boxing history, there's just no comparison.
Floyd
any sensible, credible person who has an idea of the history of the sport doesn't even give it a second thought. It's just this sort of shtick. And I'm sorry to sort of go on a rant, but
you're
that's
right.
the thing about this. You're right, because this was a boxer versus a puncher. This was in Joe Gans. You see the guy. This is the epitome of the sweet science. What he's doing against the raw, crude, brawling, keep pressuring style of battling Nelson. It was probably a breathtaking fight. There is some footage, but you do have to wonder if it looks exactly the same because of the film. It's not HD, of course, but it's the idea that the guys of today go 12 rounds. It's hard to some degree. It's like comparing apples and oranges.
Yeah, and Floyd Mayweather doesn't mention this guy in his top five, and it pisses me off because, first of all, Floyd Mayweather has never been in the gym sparring for 3 hours straight, 42 rounds. I mean, come on. He might do 40 rounds, but not all at once, not in extreme heat. I mean, these guys were so much tougher. But no, wait, there's more, Alex, because he came down with tuberculosis, they said before. So here's the guy in Joe Gans that we're talking about. And listen, all credit to Battle of Nelson, too, because obviously Battle of Nelson was in the same ring and fighting, too. But this, according to all the research that Colleen and Mark did, Battle of Nelson had started to come down with tuberculosis before this fight. So to even think that the guy, and then the next two fights it was already in full swing. But to think that he had the beginning of tuberculosis, he's fighting for 3 hours in 100-degree heat, 42 rounds. It's just, I think it's uncomprehendable. Comprehensible. I just can't imagine how you would expect a human being to endure that.
Yeah, that's the thing about it, that it really is the modern guys. Maybe they are stronger, they're bigger, but what the question of what they endure, I think, is an easy one to answer. The guys, from the past have it all over them. Even a guy like somebody like a Rocky Marciano or Jack Dempsey. I mean, especially when you're talking heavyweights, the fact that they were smaller, that's a big knock on them. But they could take punishment for rounds and rounds that we just don't see today. They stop fights later, So I don't know. But that was the thing. I mean, the thing about Joe Gans, what is interesting about it, and Colleen and Mark do a great job describing this, is how he learned that style that we see today in a lot of great fighters. He learned it in the battle royals, something that was these very racist bouts that were very often won. And Gans sort of was a victim of his own success in a way, because he got very good right away. Some of the guys in the dock workers, his bosses there would put him in fights, and sometimes they'd put him in against two guys.
Blindfolded, right?
Right, and the battle royals, yeah, very, very often the battle royals, everybody be blindfolded, and it would be a bunch of young blacks would be forced then to just fight each other, and so you'd be flailing away at each other, not knowing where you are. Now, Colleen and Mark, like I said, do a really good job describing that, of thinking about how you would naturally defend yourself in a situation like that, and how you cover up and how you'd stand, and I think they do. You can picture the style that Gans was using, with the arms up high, tight to his body, and the jab shooting out at any sound that he would hear. He was a big puncher, Joe Gans, and he did drop battling Nelson several times in that fight. But that was one of the things. I mean, he was a good person. I mean, he tried to pick him up. I mean, he helped him up in the fight, and it was eventually a foul that that he won the fight on, because he got hit so low.
Yeah, it was several times, and he finally won the fight. That fight in the 42nd round, they disqualified Battle and Nelson. His following fight after that against Kid Herman was another fantastic performance. He had a couple of stay busy fights as they were building up the rematches with Battle and Nelson. But tuberculosis had already started to kick in, Alex, and he clearly wasn't the same fighter by the time 1908 for the second fight with Battle and Nelson took place in Colma, California, and he didn't come out with a W in that one.
No, he ends up losing to Battling Nelson 2 more times, actually, which
back to back. Yeah, and he was knocked out, and they only went 17 and 21 rounds in those fights. I mean, even that is amazing to think that he went that far, and was that competitive. I'm talking about Joe Gans with tuberculosis.
Yeah, and tuberculosis was definitely something that I think I had the hearing that it's making a comeback, and I think that is because. Because of the rampant use of antibiotics in animal agriculture, bacteria is getting tougher and tougher. And I think tuberculosis, I think it's big, especially, wherever there's lots of people together.
Alex, we got the plague. The plague made a comeback. You can't even go to. I mean, did you hear they got another case of the plague?
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And they're at the park out there. What is it? Jellystone?
Oh yeah, Yellowstone. Yeah.
Yellowstone.
Jellystone.
Well, there was a
Okay, boo-boo.
Okay, hey, boo boo. I'm looking for some picnic baskets at Jellystone. But hey, listen, hold that thought. Obviously, I knew we were going to take some extra time with Joe Gans. I got to take a short break. So when we get back, we'll talk about Yogi and Boo Boo at Jellystone and the plague. We're mixing this up. We're covering all kinds of. You thought you were only going to be talking about boxing on this show? Nay. We're talking about tuberculosis, the plague, and Boo Boo and Yogi Bear. We'll be back in 2.
Talking Boxing with Billy C. Every week, 2 hours of the best boxing talk on the radio.
I have a bunch of questions, Donnell, right? If you feel like you want to, you can answer for JD first. Why will you win? JD Chapman, why will you win?
Baby Holmes will get sick and get hit by a train that day on the way to the fight, or he might have diarrhea, he might have the flu, he might throw up. One of his eyeballs might fall out that day, and I might get lucky.
Talking Boxing
with Billy C. If you want your voice heard on Talkin' Boxing with Billy C., then call our hotline at 845-228-8710. Leave a voicemail, or you could just tell Billy C. that you like his mustache.
Should I ask you your opinion about this idea?
I'm just trying to give you the encouragement.
Listen, all I need from you is to make sure you don't hang up on people.
And if we like your call, we'll play it back on the air.
You have the knowledge and wisdom of boxing because of what you do and how well you do it.
Leave your name, hometown, and what you think of the show. 845-228-8710. We want to hear you.
Hey, fight fans, check out KOFantasyBoxing.com. KO Fantasy Boxing is boxing's only trademarked fantasy game. Check it out, www.KOFantasyBoxing.com. Select your own gym, your own fighters, track them through a season that can last from 3 months to a year, depending upon which league you join. You got to check this out, man. www.KOFantasyBoxing.com. Join it today. Again, www.KOFantasyBoxing.com, and tell them Billy C sent ya.
The one, the only, Don King.
Makes me feel good, Billy, to have you, the #1 show in the country, talking boxing with Billy. So I invite each and every American that's listening to this great show to tune in, because we want you to be there with Billy and me.
Broadcasting in all corners of the globe, on the web and radio.
He would scoff at a stretch of that man, I would think.
You're listening to Talkin' Boxing with Billy C. From upstate New York and the good old US of A.
Boxing is here to stay because we are here to stay.
The best 2 hours of boxing talk on the airwaves.
And we're back. You're listening to the Talking Boxing with Billy C show. Give a shout out to all of our listeners, ESPN New Hampshire. Glad you guys could join us. And speaking of joining us, Alex Pierpaoli is with me, and we're doing our weekly blast from the past. And this week it's on former world champion boxing Hall of Famer Joe Gans. And Alex, just before we went to break, not only were we talking about Yogi Bear and Boo Boo and the plague and everything else, but in all seriousness, Joe Gans started the beginning of what ultimately took his life, tuberculosis, in 1906 in his first fight with Battling Nelson. It started to weaken this guy. Obviously, his next two fights with Battling Nelson in 1908, which incidentally were only 2 months apart, it was almost in full swing. He got knocked out in both fights. But to consider how weak tuberculosis made you, that he went 17 and 21 rounds respectively before he was stopped, it is amazing. And his final fight was a few months later, actually a little less than a year later, 6 months later, in 1909. It was kind of like a let's get him a win type of a fight when everybody knew he was on his way out. And there's some sad stuff with that train rod and everything else. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, that was. Oh, I think one thing we should mention also is that phrase, "bringing home the bacon."
Oh, that's right, with his mom, right?
Yeah, that was one of those things, that nice little piece of folklore, where before the Goldfield fight against Battling Nelson, his mother had sent him a telegram saying, I guess that was something she used to say a lot when they were kids, when he was a kid, and that she was going to bring home the bacon. And I guess he sent her a telegram saying, "Mom, I'm bringing home the bacon," because it was such a big purse. Yeah. And he did make some good money. In one of the interviews I saw with Colleen, she mentioned, and again, she does mention that sometimes these kind of things, these numbers are hard to verify. But she said in 1 year he made $180,000.
Yeah,
which is tremendous for that time.
He was smart with his money, because remember he started out with nothing on the docks in Maryland, and he was good. And that was his big thing. When he knew that he wasn't going to live much longer, he put all his financial affairs in order. And left them to his family and stuff. One thing I wanted to mention, and I forgot to mention, how times have changed. Today, a fighter decides he doesn't want to be with a promoter or manager anymore, and who cares if they have a contract or not? They stop and they battle it out in court. Well, Joe Gans tried to leave one of his managers for years, and they wouldn't let him. His name was Al Herford, and he kept trying to leave. I don't even know if they had a valid contract or not. Did you ever come across that? I don't remember seeing that in the book.
No, I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I got to ask Colleen about that. I came across it. It was actually in the Baltimore Sun in an old 1897 newspaper articles that he was, trying to get rid of his manager, Al Herford, and it took him like 5 attempts. That was the first attempt in 1897, and they wouldn't let him. They kept saying, "No, can't get rid of him. Got to keep him." But he's robbing me. He's stealing. He's doing this. Sorry, you got to keep him. But anyway, tell us about the tuberculosis and how it took his life.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing about that. Tuberculosis is really a debilitating disease, and it was probably something. It could very well have been communicated from boxer to boxer.
The gyms were. They said a lot of the time from the gyms because of the unsanitary conditions. A spit bucket was hanging around in the non-air conditioned gym for days, not being cleaned.
Right, and I mean the thing about it is that you definitely what it would feel like. It attacks the lungs. I guess it can attack other body tissues as well, but primarily it's the lungs. And it would you cough up blood. Would probably feel very much like a severe asthma attack when you exert yourself, and I think eventually that is what you die of. It's almost as if you drown in your own bodily humors. In the bleeding. There's bleeding in your lungs. And I think even their consumption, I think it's, that was one of those things where really even older, a couple of 100 years before, there's actually cases here in Connecticut, and there was a couple in Rhode Island where people died of tuberculosis and then were suspected to be vampires because of that, the blood, the spitting up of blood, and the communicative disease, because whoever cared for the person very often would come up down with it as well. So they figured, well, this thing, how could they get it now? They're dying, they're bleeding they're coughing up blood too. And then when they would exhume the first victim, there would be blood on the lips, so it would look as if, they must have come back and fed on the living.
Well,
so yeah, it was because at the time, there wasn't, penicillin. A lot of things like that, if you got it, you're done for.
Well,
and it eventually would kill you, and that is what happened. It was, he slowly wore down.
All they did, and it's ironic. And by the way, everybody was a vampire in New England. Come on, I mean, you wouldn't have the folklore if they didn't burn witches at the stake over there. But the thing is in all seriousness, tuberculosis, where I happen to live right now, in the Adirondacks, was one of the places that they would ship people with tuberculosis in the winters, because that was the only thing they could do, would bring them in a cold environment. And there's actually photos, and I believe Joe Gans actually came up, I don't know if it was here or out west or something, but in the mountains, and they have photos from the early 1900s, late 1800s, with everybody with tuberculosis wrapped in blankets, sitting out on porches in the snow. I mean, that's what that was the only thing they could do to alleviate that burning sensation in their chests.
Ugh, God.
I know.
Yeah,
I know.
It's got to be awful.
But anyway, he had a real sad trip home. He knew that he was dying and he wasn't going to make it. And the way Colleen and Mark described that train ride, which he ultimately died. Then there was problem where the body was going to be. I mean, this guy just didn't really get the respect he should have gotten, Alex.
He sure didn't, and that is something that's changing now. And as a matter of fact, I should mention this. I think it's called the Friends of Joe Gans. Let me see here. But this was something that Colleen talks about too in a lot of the interviews she does, where the first time she went to the cemetery, and this is one of those things, I guess, we should talk about Floyd Mayweather again. I can't help but do it. Especially with that perspective of taking, respecting history. Colleen has the utmost respect for a guy like Mike Tyson, because, say what you will about him, he is someone who sought out the grave of Joe Gans just to go there, because he knew who he was and wanted to show those respects. And Colleen went to the cemetery as well when she was doing the research on the book, and it was very understated, and people weren't very aware of it. I mean, it was like, they weren't aware of the history, but that has changed now. There is an organization, and it has a Facebook page, Friends of Joe Gans. And I think there's even, of course, there's the famous statue at Madison Square Garden that a lot of fighters rub his glove on their way to the ring for luck. There's a statue of Joe Gans. I thought I remember reading something about this organization or some artist who's trying to make a statue for some place in Baltimore of Joe Gans, but I think they were accepting donations at some point. And that's another thing also, I did want to mention that because it was sort of blast from the past oriented, but there's supposed to be a big statue unveiling coming up. I think it's in September for the Joe Frazier statue. And that's something that, a guy like Joe Gans certainly deserves one as well. But Frazier is supposed to be getting one. I don't know if you've ever seen that. I think there is a video of it. The statue, it looks beautiful.
I saw the first version of it. Then they flipped out because it didn't even look like them. And it's not even made. Is that the one that's not even made out of stone? That's made out of like some other product?
I don't know. I saw Hopkins was looking at it. I thought it was something with, and HBO did something with it, and it was pretty impressive. It looks like he's like throwing a left hook, very similar of the, it's just like that Frazier left, it kind of looks like the famous in the first Ali fight.
Hey, how old was Joe Gans when he passed away?
I think he's only 30. Let's see.
30, right? Was he maybe 30? 31?
1874. Yeah, 34.
34.
Yeah, no, 44.
No.
1874 to 1910. They did not know the exact date of his birth.
Well, considering that this guy fought the number of fights that he had and only ended up with 10 losses and stopped 5 times, 2 of which was when he was tuberculosis, is amazing. It's amazing. Who did you put him in with?
Well, hold on a second about that date. I'm sorry about that. Cyber Boxing Zone says it was around 44. BoxRec, maybe they're basing this off. I didn't check Colleen's book for the date.
BoxRec says he's 140 right now. Yeah, I didn't.
That he was.
Yeah, I didn't think he was in his 40s. I thought he was 31. To be honest with you, that number sticks out.
Yeah,
that number sticks out.
36.
That 31 sticks out in my head for some reason. But if you go to BoxRec, at least when I generated my notes here, it says he's 140 right now. It doesn't give his death, because they had that bug in there.
Yeah, they did have a bug in there. He's 140.
He's 140. God bless him. But
he looks great.
Yeah, he looks great. But anyway,
okay.
Title bout championship.
Yes, because we're in the process of redoing the rankings. There's 3 guys that are right up there, and I put them in the title bout championship boxing game simulator. First, I put him in against Jorge Linares, and Gans won a unanimous decision. He really swept him, controlled the fight. 119 to 109, 120 to 109, and 117 to 111. That was the Al Heyman judge in there. And then when I had them fight 100 times, Gans dominates. 93 wins, 4 defeats, 3 draws. He stopped Linares 59 times. Of Linares' 4 measly wins, he was able to stop Joe Gans 2 times. Then I had him fight Mickey Bay. The first time they fought, Bay really won, did well the first half of the fight, the first 4 or 5 rounds, and then Gans took over and stopped him at 25 seconds of round number 11. When they fought 100 times, Joe Gans dominates. 96 wins, 3 defeats, 1 draw. He stopped Bay 79 times. Of Bay's 3 wins, he won them all by knockout. And then finally, I had to put him in there against Miguel Vazquez, and he beat him by unanimous decision. The first time, 2 scores of 117 to 112, and 1 score of 119 111. And then out of the 100, he went 90 wins, 5 losses, 5 defeats. He stopped him only 10 times, so Vazquez was able to survive pretty well against the big puncher and Joe Gans. And of Vazquez's 5 wins, he did stop Joe Gans twice.
Not this second, but maybe for the next time you call in, maybe later in the week, I would love to have you run a simulation, Joe Gans, 100 fights against Roberto Duran at lightweight. And
that would be
see
good.
what title bout comes out with. But anyway, Joe Gans, he was a former world lightweight champion. His career record, 145 wins, 100 by knockout. Okay, 10 losses, in which I said earlier only was stopped 5 times. He did have 16 draws. He also fought during that newspaper era where he had 13 wins, 2 losses, and 5 draws. He fought 1,607 rounds as a pro with a 51% knockout ratio. He was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 1990. Joe Gans, arguably by most, a pound-for-pound top 5 fighter, definitely in the top 10. He was our blast from the past today. And Alex, great job as usual with that. Before I